My name is Susanne Berger, and it is a true honor to meet you, even though it's only virtually. A quick word about my background. I'm a historian with special focus on the Wallenberg case and the long-term disappeared. I'm the founder and coordinator of the Raoul Wallenberg Research Initiative, and since 2015 we've made a concerted effort to address the remaining gaps in the official Wallenberg case record. And some of the information that we've been able to collect in recent years directly challenges several long-held assumptions in the case by opening up a somewhat different perspective of certain aspects of the Wallenberg mystery. And you will see that throughout this presentation. So let us delve right in. I want to give you a brief overview of the current state of the research into Wallenberg's fate in Russia. After 80 years, crucial questions remain on both sides of the case, Swedish and Russian. In Russia, the main question really is, why was Raoul Wallenberg arrested, but mainly, why did Stalin decide not to return him? And then, of course, what exactly happened to Raoul Wallenberg when his trail breaks off in the spring of 1947. As concerns Sweden, the general thesis has been that the failure to rescue Raoul Wallenberg was the result of the confluence of a number of really very unfortunate circumstances, like chaotic post-war conditions, individual incompetence, Wallenberg's status as an outsider in Swedish society, or also very much Sweden's overwhelming fear of the Soviet Union. All these factors undoubtedly played a role, but our new findings very strongly suggest that Swedish abandonment of Raoul Wallenberg was a conscious decision by Swedish officials driven by a variety of motives. So the core question on the Swedish side now is, why was Sweden's passivities so extreme? Why was Raoul Wallenberg expendable, and especially during the crucial year of 1946, at a moment when the Soviet leadership had signaled a more conciliatory attitude towards Sweden, and when it appeared that Raoul Wallenberg was really possibly still alive and imprisoned in the Soviet Union? And then how did this decision affect the later investigation of his fate, including the work of the official Swedish-Russian working group that studied his case in the 1990s for 10 years, from 1991 to 2001. I was actually serving as a consultant to this group. So for a historical figure of Raoul Wallenberg's stature, we have surprisingly few direct sources about his life. And until a few years ago, we really only had a few black and white photographs. And then by a fortunate accident, we discovered a brief film footage of Raoul Wallenberg. So pay close attention. Raoul Wallenberg is sitting on the right side of your screen. And these are really the only moving images we have of him. It shows Raoul Wallenberg as an instructor of the Swedish Home Guard during World War II. He's supervising the shooting practice, and he was apparently highly regarded, and the experience he gathered there really was very, very important for his later experience in Budapest. Here are two more images of Raoul Wallenberg that have emerged only in recent years, and they show him about 1 year before he left for Hungary. So Raoul was born in 1912 to his mother Mai von Dardel and his father Raoul Oskar Wallenberg, who died shortly before Raoul was born. As a result, he grew up outside of the powerful Wallenberg business family, which really had important consequences for his later life. And you have probably already heard much about the impressive protection effort Wallenberg and his colleagues put into place in Hungary in 1944. And I just wanted to show you again the central document of that mission, the famous Schutzpass, the protective passport. I still get chills whenever I look at that document. And so one of the individuals holding one of these protective passports was Raoul Wallenberg's assistant, Wilhelm Schlangenfelder. He also served as his driver. He unfortunately did not survive either and died in Soviet imprisonment. So once the Soviet army occupied Budapest, Raoul Wallenberg made contact with the Soviet military officers around January 13, and he asked to be put in touch with the headquarters of General Malinovsky in order to seek protection for the surviving Jewish population. You see here the letter Vladimir Dekhanosov, the Soviet deputy foreign minister, wrote to the Swedish minister in Moscow, Staffan Söderblom. Remember that name. He's a person who really is central to this whole case. stating that Soviet forces had placed Raoul Wallenberg and his belongings under official protection, which means that at this point in time, everyone was actually feeling quite good about Raoul Wallenberg, and they were actually far more worried about his colleagues who had not been heard from. Soviet military counterintelligence was suspicious of all foreigners, and they immediately took notice of this rather bold foreign diplomat. And on January 19, 1945, the order came from Moscow, almost certainly from Stalin personally, but signed by the Deputy Defense Minister Nikolai Bulganin, to detain Raoul Wallenberg and to take him to the Soviet Union. He was to be kept isolated and was not allowed to send any communications to Sweden or his associates. So from now on, Wallenberg's life was in the hands of this man, Viktor Abakumov, Minister of State Security, who reported directly to Stalin. Wallenberg and Langfelder arrived in Moscow on February 5th and were taken to the NKGB headquarters, the famous Lubyanka. Lubyanka was one of the main investigation prisons. This is where detainees were held before they were formally charged and sentenced. And after sentencing, prisoners were sent to so-called punishment prisons or camps. On the right of the slide, you see a photo of the so-called internal prison of Lubyanka. This was a special section where the most important prisoners were housed. At the time of arrival, every prisoner was registered. You see here Raoul Wallenberg's formal prisoner card as it was filled in February 1945. Prisoners underwent a highly intrusive, uncomfortable personal search, and their belongings were confiscated and placed into storage. Prisoners were also fingerprinted and photographed. And since Raoul Wallenberg's personal file has never been recovered, I thought I'd show you an example of another foreigner, the American communist and Soviet agent Isaiah Oggins. Oggins was detained in 1939, and this photo shows him on the night of his arrival. To give you a sense of how difficult the conditions were for some prisoners, I want to show you a photo of Oggins 8 years later, shortly before his death. I want to warn you, it does not make for easy viewing, but I really want you to have a realistic idea of what it meant to be a prisoner in the Soviet Union at the time. It is shocking and heart-wrenching to see his condition. Raoul Wallenberg was apparently treated well comparatively. As far as we know, he was interrogated fairly rarely, only about half a dozen times. After a few months, Wallenberg was transferred to another investigative prison, Lefortovo, in another section of Moscow. And in Lefortovo, 2 prisoners were interrogated. And here you see an excerpt from an interrogation register for December 1945. This is how we saw these registers during the inquiry in the 1990s. The entry was blacked out in order to hide the presence and the identity of the prisoner. And in this case, the name that is being blacked out is Raoul Wallenberg. It was made visible in the working group investigation, so we know it is his name that's hidden here. And here you see the last interrogation entry for Wallenberg on March 11, 1947, this time in Lubyanka. And this is really the last documented presence we have of Raoul Wallenberg in the Soviet Union. So I will return to these registers in a moment, but for now I want to switch location and return to Sweden. When Wallenberg disappeared without a trace, one would assume that Swedish authorities would launch a vigorous effort to track him down, and this was unfortunately not the case. The new foreign minister, Östen Undén, whom you see here on the left, was extremely pro-Soviet. He was a respected legal scholar, and he really believed that the Soviet Union would respect the tenets of international law. He was also opposed to what he considered human trade, meaning any kind of prisoner swaps or exchanges. And then, due to the chaotic wartime conditions, both Östen Undén and Staffan Söderblom, the minister in Moscow, doubted that Raoul Wallenberg had ever been taken to the Soviet Union, despite the receipt that had been issued by the Soviet side by Vladimir Dekhanosov in December 1945. So Raoul Wallenberg's diplomatic colleagues, 2 were detained by Soviet military forces, but in April they were allowed to travel through Moscow on their way home to Sweden. At the time, a Soviet-controlled radio station had reported that Raoul Wallenberg was dead. Allegedly, he had been murdered by Gestapo agents in Hungary. So this is important to keep in mind, because Soviet authorities had accused the legation of having provided, for example, Swedish protective documents also to Hungarian and German Nazis in some strange dealings, and to have failed to prevent the mistreatment of Soviet prisoners of war. So therefore, it is quite possible and also humanly understandable that Wallenberg's colleagues did perhaps try to in some ways distance themselves from him and his activities while they themselves were under Soviet protection, and when they really thought Wallenberg was dead. But we truly do not know what actually transpired, because interestingly, the Russian interrogation protocols with these Swedish legation members have never been released. We also have some important gaps about this issue on the Swedish side. So the question arises, what were Swedish officials really worried about, and what was driving their thinking? Well, in 1945, the Swedish government was really keenly focused on improving relations with the Soviet Union. And there are also indications that Swedish officials apparently considered Raoul Wallenberg, or rather his arrest, as a potential risk factor in various ways. There were, for example, some fears that the broad extent of Sweden's wartime business dealings with Nazi Germany would become wider known if Wallenberg were to appear in a public show trial, for example. And it is quite telling that during the initial 18 months after Wallenberg's disappearance, Staffan Söderblom asked Soviet officials at least 3 or 4 times to declare Wallenberg dead, despite the absence of any clear evidence. So previous investigations have asserted that Wallenberg was essentially doomed from the moment of his arrest, because Stalin supposedly showed no interest in any negotiations or making any concessions to Sweden. However, as we now know, in April 1946, Stalin signaled a wish to reduce tensions with Sweden, and Stalin and the Soviet leadership actually offered the Swedish government a very clear quid pro quo. If a large Swedish-Soviet credit and trade agreement valued at about $300 million, which would be around 4 billion or more in today's value, would be concluded still by the end of the year, favorable conditions would be created between Sweden and the Soviet Union. So already by the end of May 1946, barely a month later, a high-level official Swedish delegation traveled to Moscow to enter into detailed discussions about the agreement. And then barely a month later, again, Ambassador Söderblom had a rare personal audience with Stalin himself in June 1946. So just as troubling is the fact that even when the trade agreement was successfully concluded at the end of 1946, Swedish officials still did not raise the case and the question of Wallenberg's fate with the Soviet side. So for that reason, assertions that Raoul Wallenberg was essentially doomed from the moment that he was arrested are really highly problematic. This failure to raise the case is all the more remarkable because at this particular moment in time, Swedish officials and Söderblom personally had received actually very strong indications that Raoul Wallenberg was alive and imprisoned in the Soviet Union. So again, the question, what were Swedish officials worried about? Another potential subject of concern for Swedish officials could have been the Swedish intelligence operations in Hungary during the year 1943-45, which possibly compromised Raoul Wallenberg in the eyes of both Swedish and Soviet officials. New records reveal that these operations that were really not very well known for many, many decades, that they began much earlier and were much more extensive than previously known. They already began in October 1943, meaning 9 months really before Wallenberg was ever selected for the humanitarian mission. So while Wallenberg's activities in Budapest were mainly, primarily humanitarian, his work also involved other aspects, such as the contacts with the Hungarian anti-Nazi resistance and efforts to safeguard the extensive interests of Sweden and the Western allies in the region. The aims of the Hungarian resistance were really threefold. to defeat Nazism and to secure Hungary's exit from the war, to prevent a Soviet occupation, if possible, and to ensure Hungary's democratic future. So we already knew that Raoul Wallenberg's mission was financed by American money and had the support of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA. So the Soviets were already highly suspicious about that. But CIA records released in the early 1990s show that the Swedish foreign military intelligence, in close cooperation with US intelligence in Stockholm, tried to support the Hungarian resistance in the autumn of 1944 by providing a secret signal plan that was to be used during an uprising, a revolt against the German occupation. This also involved the presence of several Swedish signal intelligence agents, and again, very little is known about their activities to this day, because all of the relevant information in Swedish archives is either missing or destroyed. And so many unanswered questions about this particular aspect of the case. So one of Hungary's largest and most important resistance groups was the MFM, the Hungarian Independence Movement, and its leader, Dr. Géza Sós, whom you see here in the middle, played a central role in these plans. He had direct contact with both Raoul Wallenberg and Wallenberg's close colleague, Swedish First Secretary Per Anger, who, like Wallenberg, was honored by Yad Vashem for his rescue work after the war. Matter of fact, Sós was among the first people Raoul Wallenberg met after he arrived in Hungary in July 1944. So according to the statements of several witnesses, both Wallenberg and Anger occasionally transported weapons and ammunitions in their diplomatic cars intended for the resistance, and even offered financial support for the purchase of arms and other supplies. There are still several unconfirmed reports that Wallenberg and the resistance also collected information about war crimes and atrocities committed by the Red Army in Hungary and Poland. And this would have, of course, placed Wallenberg in an extremely precarious position. We also learned that in recent years, Sweden entered into a secret intelligence sharing agreement with Hungarian representatives about the Soviet Union. And some of these activities reporting on the Soviet Union already involved certain post-war considerations. This involved, for example, reporting structures through the foreign affiliates of Swedish companies in Eastern Europe, including Wallenberg companies. So such activities were extremely problematic because the Swedish government was not only, Sweden was neutral, but the Swedish government also represented Soviet interests in Hungary since 1941. So given Wallenberg and Anger's status as Swedish diplomats, some of their actions would have really constituted a violation of Swedish neutrality, or at least a serious transgression of diplomatic norms. So in summary, both Wallenberg's humanitarian mission and his disappearance should now really be viewed in this much broader, much more complex context. It also gives rise to the question, as I mentioned earlier, if his selection for the humanitarian mission in June 1944 was as unexpected as it generally has been portrayed. And Wallenberg also had close contact with many of the main actors involved in these intelligence operations. And in particular, for example, Helmut Ternberg, the head of the Swedish, or he was the deputy head of the Swedish military intelligence, and his brother, the naval officer Egon Ternberg, was one of Raoul Wallenberg's godfathers. You also see here on the right Carl Bunde, a very young Carl Bunde, who was the head of Swedish counterintelligence, and he was the stepson of Raoul Wallenberg's aunt, Ebba Bunde, who turned out to be the sister of Marcus and Jakob Wallenberg, the very powerful, influential bankers. And all of these operations, were running and coordinated really through the Hungarian legation in Stockholm and the Hungarian minister Antal Ullán-Revicki, whom you see here. So, since we're talking about the Wallenbergs, I want to briefly discuss the noticeable passive attitude taken by Wallenberg's very powerful relative Marcus and Jakob Wallenberg. This passivity, in many ways, is very curious because the Wallenbergs have a history of negotiating very hard on behalf of their employees and their family members when there is a crisis. So various possible reasons have been given for this passivity, namely that Raoul was really raised outside of the family, that he was in some ways considered a rival, plus the fact that the brothers were really very seriously distracted by the US Treasury Department investigation into their wartime business dealings with Nazi Germany. But there are really no signs that they ever pushed Swedish officials into taking more determined action on behalf of Raoul. And that is reason for pause, so to speak. Marcus Wallenberg wrote 2 letters to the influential Soviet ambassador in Stockholm, Alexander Kollontai. And interestingly, there was really a split between the 2 brothers. Jakob appears to have pursued his own behind-the-scenes efforts separate from Marcus, and it will be fascinating to learn more about these contacts and the reason for this split. Jakob and Raoul had relatively close personal relationships, and many questions remain also about Raoul Wallenberg's personal and professional background. His company had a much more important wartime role than previously known. So again, many questions that still remain to be answered. In any case, the extreme passivity that characterized Swedish efforts was really too much for Maj von Dardel, Raoul Wallenberg's mother. And by March 1947, she was so upset and exasperated that in a tense meeting, she confronted Swedish officials why they assumed that her son was dead when they really did not have any kind of evidence, any clear evidence that he was dead. And she also decried their lack of enthusiasm and accused them of being cold-blooded. And that's a very strong word, especially for a woman of her generation, and that she was driven to this kind of action at that point shows you the level of desperation and also the level of anger. In June 1946, Stalin granted Söderblom a rare personal audience, and the meeting really proved decisive in the Wallenberg case in the eyes of many historians, or rather, at least it proved fateful. As he had done earlier, Söderblom expressed once again his personal opinion that Raoul Wallenberg had died in Hungary, and he asked Stalin to provide official confirmation that Wallenberg was dead. And it has long been held that Söderblom really acted on his own volition, that he acted independently without authorization. However, a new book by Söderblom's great niece appears to confirm that his superiors clearly knew of and almost certainly approved and instructed him to seek a meeting with Stalin. Therefore, it really needs to be stressed that Söderblom's actions were in many ways representative of the norm rather than an exception to the Swedish Foreign Ministry's position in the case. And this again also raises important questions about the reasons behind this official Swedish passivity. Why were they not interested in really fighting for Raoul Wallenberg, trying to find out the truth? So the outcome of the meeting with Stalin was the so-called Wyszynski Note, a very important document that was issued in August 1947, named after Andrei Wyszynski, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it stated that Raoul Wallenberg is unknown to us and is not on the territory of the Soviet Union. So this even further increased Swedish passivity in the question, despite the fact that several witnesses returning from Soviet imprisonment began to report about hearing about Raoul Wallenberg in the Soviet Union. It's important to note that key records related to the preparation of the Wyszynski Note continue to be missing or remain inaccessible in Russia. And that's a very interesting thing, because this also underscores that the Russian side clearly has more information that researchers have not been able to review, or that the Russian side chose not to disclose. As more information emerged about Wallenberg's possible imprisonment in the Soviet Union, the Swedish government in 1952 finally issued a new démarche, this time directly demanding Raoul Wallenberg's return. And this is the first time in 7 years since his disappearance that they did so. Before, they only asked for clarification. And that's also very telling. But Östlund Undén and other officials remained highly skeptical and extremely reluctant to push the case further. And by 1955-56, behind the scenes, they told Soviet officials that they would be quite happy with an incomplete solution, meaning a statement a statement from Soviet authorities that would hint at Wallenberg's disappearance being an act of Beria. You see here on the slide the statement even of the successor to Söderblom, Rolf Sohlmann, that basically this was now the message to the Soviets that just tell us it was Beria's doing. So this is exactly what Sweden then received a few months later, the kind of answer it received. In February 1957, Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko announced that Wallenberg supposedly had suddenly died 10 years earlier in his prison cell in Moscow, supposedly of a myocardial infarction. As only evidence, he presented a handwritten note from the head of the medical services in Lubyanka, Dr. Smoltsov. And so many questions remain about this document. But first of all, let me note that already Gromyko lied, because this was not the only document that the Russian side had in its archives. And Russian officials have never explained how and where this document was discovered and what was really behind these events and the creation of this document. However, Russian officials maintain to this day that it reveals the truth about Wallenberg's fate, if not in fact, but in spirit, meaning Wallenberg died around this time, if not of a heart attack, that he was killed or that he died as accidental killing during interrogation or similar. So obviously there are only so many possibilities of what could have happened to Raoul Wallenberg in the spring of 1947. He could have been killed. He could have stayed under investigation in Lubyanka prison, or he could have been charged and sentenced and transferred to a punishment prison. One of the most notorious isolation prisons in the Soviet Union was Vladimir Centre prison. It's located about 150 kilometers outside of Moscow. Numerous witnesses allege that they heard of Wallenberg being held in this prison. The problem is that it has never been possible to independently corroborate a single one of these testimonies. That in itself does not mean that they are not true, but it is a fact that it has not been possible to confirm Wallenberg's presence in Vladimir. So this brings us right away to a very interesting period in the early 1960s. And one of the most compelling testimonies is the report by a former American prisoner in the Soviet Union and in Vladimir prison, Dr. Marvin Makinen. Dr. Makinen was later on also a member of the Swedish-Russian working group, and he was working very, very closely for many years with Guy von Dardel, Raoul Wallenberg's brother. Makinen stated that one of his cellmates, the Latvian prisoner Sigurds Krumich, told him that he had met a highly secret Swedish prisoner in Vladimir in the 1950s. And right at the same time, around 1961, the Swedish professor Nanna Schwarz reported that a top-level colleague of hers, the leading cardiologist Professor Myasnikov, told her at a medical congress in Moscow that he was aware of Wallenberg's imprisonment in the Soviet Union. Myasnikov almost immediately denied that he ever made such a statement and claimed that Schwarz had misunderstood him, and so the issue was never resolved. But this was the testimony that Schwarz gave. The Swedes had heard about Makinen's statement. So it's important to understand that Sweden at the same time had a crucial bargaining chip. In the summer of 1963, Swedish authorities had arrested Swedish Air Force Colonel Stig Wennerström as a Soviet agent. He was really one of the most serious agents during the Cold War. His detention was really a very significant step. So here you would think that Sweden is holding a true trump card. However, Swedish officials decided to inform the Soviet government that they had no intention of linking the two cases, Wennerström and Wallenberg, a truly major missed opportunity. Sweden has never really offered a full explanation for this decision. It's very strange because this is not stipulated by Swedish law. One can understand that there are certain policy considerations, but at the same time, why would you rob yourself of your strongest argument and your strongest pressure point? A similar scenario would arise in 1981 when a Soviet submarine was stranded in Swedish territorial waters. Again, Swedish officials refused to use the incident to press Soviet authorities about Raoul Wallenberg, and it remains really a mystery why they never did that. So, with no indication that the Soviet side was willing to provide any additional information about Wallenberg and his disappearance, the Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander decided to remove the Wallenberg case from the official Swedish-Soviet agenda, where it remained, unfortunately, for the next 15 years. Only witness testimonies in the late 1970s eventually revived the case. But this new information unfortunately came too late for Mai and Frederick von Dardel, now in their late 80s and absolutely worn out from their decades-long fight for their son. The couple tragically decided to end their lives in 1979. So with the new testimonies that emerged in the late 70s, early 80s, plus the wish of the American government to confront the Soviet Union more directly, there was really a revival of the Wallenberg case. It is then that Wallenberg becomes a truly celebrated international figure, culminating in President Ronald Reagan designating Wallenberg as an honorary citizen, the first one to receive this honor really since Winston Churchill. And this photo shows Wallenberg's siblings Nina Lagergren and Guy von Dardel at the signing ceremony at the White House. When the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev some years later ushered in his policies of the gradual opening of the Soviet Union, glasnost, perestroika, etc., it became clear that if political relations with the West, and in particular with Sweden, were to advance, painful historical issues like the Wallenberg case from the Cold War needed to be resolved. And this resulted then in an invitation to Wallenberg's family to Moscow in 1989, where they were handed Raoul Wallenberg's personal possessions, including his diplomatic passport, various monetary bills, his prisoner card, as well as his appointment calendar and address book. KGB officials claimed that they had just weeks earlier discovered these items purely by accident during certain renovations in the KGB archive. Needless to say, serious questions remain about this rather fortuitous discovery, and we now know that this visit was not just a spur-of-the-moment decision, but was really in the making months, if not years, beforehand. But still, as a direct result of Gorbachev's invitation, Raoul Wallenberg's brother, Guy von Dardel, created an international commission which traveled to Moscow, and its members were granted unprecedented access to certain Russian archival collections. And this research really produced the first direct evidence that Wallenberg had been held in Soviet imprisonment. And it resulted in the KGB immediately shutting down researchers' access to these key collections. But before the research was stopped, Guy von Dardel, Marvin Makinen, and experts from the now-defunct Memorial Society were able to review the prisoner card registry in Vladimir prison. And they made really highly interesting discoveries, including the system of numbering highly important prisoners. And the team was able to continue and even expand its work well into the 1990s. Russian authorities, and that's important to note, however, refused access to other very important materials that could have aided the investigation. In particular, like key internal correspondence file of the prison and with central Moscow. And so they also did not permit access to crucial investigation files of Wallenberg's fellow prisoners. And so despite the appearance of Russian goodwill in the early 1990s, at least to a certain extent, it is also clear that Russian authorities really decided from the start to keep the Wallenberg investigation as limited as possible. They also intentionally withheld crucial information from the official Swedish working group investigation, which had succeeded the first commission established by Guy von Dardel. These details, I want to stress, these details the Russian side decided to withhold were far from trivial, but they went straight to the heart of the Wallenberg investigation. Most importantly, Russian officials intentionally held back documentation that suggests that in 1947, Wallenberg was possibly held as a numbered prisoner, prisoner number 7, and that he may well have been alive 6 days after his official death date of July 17, 1947. However, when this information was finally revealed in 2009, Swedish representatives did not energetically pursue this most sensational piece of information to emerge in the Wallenberg case since 1945 or possibly since 1957. So let me stress again, Russian officials have known about this information for decades, yet deliberately withheld it, and also other crucial details. The reason for this is we don't know exactly why, but possibly they did not want to have to bother with any kind of publicity surrounding this issue of, a later date of death. But on the Swedish side, as late as 2019, Swedish officials also failed to disclose to Wallenberg's family and the public that two high-level Russian officials in fact had confirmed that Raoul Wallenberg was identical with prisoner number 7 and conceded that Raoul Wallenberg could have been alive after his official death date. A central piece of information. And even worse, some of the documentation pertaining to this issue was never registered or archived in the official Wallenberg dossier in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Again, a very serious matter. Russian authorities argue that even if they lied about Raoul Wallenberg's date of death or if they didn't disclose all the information, it does not matter because Raoul Wallenberg must have died a short time later anyway. Plus, they do not possess any further information or documentation about the full circumstances of Wallenberg's fate. Swedish officials have essentially accepted the Russian position despite strong indications to the contrary and despite knowing that the Russian side has consistently lied since Wallenberg's disappearance in 1945. This clearly, the Swedish side has in many ways signaled that they are quite content with incomplete solutions, and this position really now runs like a red thread through the whole Wallenberg investigation. So the burden of research right now rests squarely on researchers in the Wallenberg family because the Swedish government is not conducting any further inquiries. Swedish officials also withheld other important information, including the fact that there were about 500 other Swedish prisoners in Soviet imprisonment. And you remember Professor Makinen's statement about a highly secret prisoner, a Swedish prisoner in Vladimir. This meant that witnesses who reported meeting or hearing about a Swedish prisoner were not fantasizing or lying, as they were often accused. Instead, many simply assumed that any Swede in the Soviet Union had to be Raoul Wallenberg. And if researchers and Wallenberg's family had received more detailed information about when and where some of these nationals were imprisoned, it would have made the whole Wallenberg investigation far more efficient. Another potentially serious question is if, aside from Stig Wennerström, there were other Soviet agents in the Swedish government apparatus, agents or assets during the Cold War era, including some leading Swedish diplomats. Suspicions have persisted for years about the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Rolf Sohlman, and one of Sweden's most prominent diplomats, the former cabinet secretary and head of Sweden's delegation to the United Nations, Sverker Åström. Both men played a central role in the Wallenberg investigation for many decades. In fact, we just recently discovered that Ambassador Sohlman's longtime back channel to the Soviet government was one of the most notorious KGB counterintelligence officers. For more than 4 years during 1959 to 63, the two discussed the most sensitive matters of state, including new and at the time extremely secret details in the Wallenberg case. So the potential implication of this discovery is truly profound, because as a result, hundreds, if not thousands, of pages must be preserved in the KGB archive, chronicling the background of these discussions and of the Wallenberg case. None of these materials were accessible to previous investigations, and there's no real overlap with other archives. It means that potentially much more information in the case is available in Russia, and also that the full truth about his fate may very well be known. I also want to emphasize that this crucial clue came from previously classified Swedish documentation, another indication that important information remains in Swedish and other international archives, Russian archives, and it's so crucial that researchers get full and direct, unhindered access to this material, in particular researchers who really understand the case. I should add that, of course, one of the problems is that in Sweden, the files of Rolf Sohmann and Ostrom remain completely classified. So in conclusion, there are strong indications that both Swedish and Russian officials kept the focus of the Wallenberg investigation intentionally narrow, misrepresented and omitted important details and information in the case from their respective official reports, and failed to provide access to key documentation to researchers and Wallenberg's family. What is also very clear, and this is a very important point, is that virtually from its inception, the official Wallenberg investigation has been suffering from an inherent conflict of interest. While the family and researchers' sole focus was really on the wish to rescue Raoul and to learn the full circumstances of his fate, the primary interest of Swedish and Russian officials was to contain any potential collateral damage. And during the 1990s, the main aim was really to resolve the case just enough to be able to remove it from the Swedish-Russian official agenda. So what emerges is the question if there ever was a spoken or unspoken understanding or possible coordination between Swedish and Russian authorities to keep the inquiry in carefully guarded boundaries, to protect special interests, or to avoid sensitive revelations. It was certainly never this idea that Sweden and Russia now have no reason to keep, the information secret. It was always a very sensitive subject. I think this realization we have to stress and also make ourselves aware. The possibility must now be seriously examined that there could have been this kind of wish to keep things in a very limited and very narrow focus. And this examination should really happen quickly, as institutional knowledge of the Wallenberg case and other Cold War mysteries is fading very fast in both Sweden and Russia. We see this very much in Sweden, where the younger generation of Swedish diplomats really has no detailed understanding of the case and has to really rely on what older colleagues tell them, and that's sometimes really very problematic. So if Raoul Wallenberg and other Swedish citizens who disappeared in the Soviet Union were consciously left to their fate, it would not only constitute in many ways a serious moral failure, but it could really rise to the level of obstruction and even to that of criminal neglect. It follows that in such a scenario, the decades-long efforts by Raoul Wallenberg's family and researchers may well have been, in many ways, a waste of time, energy, money, and good faith. That's a rather sobering thought, and we have to hope that that is not the case, but we have to wonder. So Raoul Wallenberg definitely deserves better, and members of Wallenberg's family, researchers, and also some parliamentarians have repeatedly called now for a new independent investigation into the official handling of his fate, and I'm quite confident that the information presented here will only make this call appear even louder. So thank you very much for your time, and I now open the floor for questions. Thank you so much.
So you spent a long time investigating the fate of Raoul Wallenberg. I think I would have to say that you are the preeminent investigator of this great man's fate. What do you think we can learn that's positive from these many decades of search into exactly what happened to him? What's good about the story that you're telling us?
Well, what is good about the story is that, number one, the resilience of the family not to give up and to insist on the truth. I think that's one of the most important aspects of this case, which is often, portrayed as sort of an unwillingness to accept the inevitable and being stubborn, but in fact, how I see this is that, this is also, in a way, another form of resistance, because Wallenberg was the one who resisted he took on a totalitarian system and fell victim to another. And his family's absolute refusal to give up, to say, he is ours, and we want to know the truth about this one man. That is really, when you think about what distinguishes democracies from totalitarianism, it is how they define the rights of individuals versus the overarching interests of the state. If the defense of fundamental individual human rights is what makes democracy special. So this, to me, is the epitome. Insisting on the truth really is, for me, the core value that this case embodies.
That's a fantastic point, especially in today's climate. What do you think that Wallenberg really did manage, obviously with the help of other diplomats? Do you think this figure of 100,000 is exaggerated? Tell us a little bit more about exactly how people have assessed how many Jews he saved.
Well, when Wallenberg arrived in Budapest in July, there had already been some massive deportations. So by the time, this was one of the most cruel and horrendous chapter of the Holocaust, almost at the end of the war, when in the period of, I think, 6 months, basically 500,000 Hungarian Jews were deported and ultimately killed, murdered. So when Wallenberg arrived, there was a pause in the deportations, but there were only about 150,000 possibly Jews left in Budapest. And so it became really essential to protect this group of people. And the system that he put in place, I think this is often underestimated, this enormous system that he put in place together with a lot of different groups, from the Hungarian resistance, from the other international neutral diplomats, from his colleagues at the Swedish legation, that they found a way to house, feed, and protect this group of people in specially designated houses. So when we say that Raoul Wallenberg saved 100,000 Jews or so, that is possibly exaggerated, but at the same time, he certainly made a great contribution to being sure that a lot of these people survived and were able to manage, to find protection in these from this terrible persecution.
What is your theory about what happened to him? Obviously it might not be based in complete fact, but what's your hunch? What's your feeling about his end?
So many people have asked me that, and I always basically answer this question like this, because for so many decades, everybody has tried to guess, has tried to speculate, has tried to wonder. And so this is really the core issue of our project, of our research project, that we're trying to get away from that. We want to fill in the blanks of the blank spots in the official case record, so that we operate from fact. And what we do know for sure is that his trail breaks off in Lubyanka in the spring of 1947. We know that there are questions about the official, proof of his death that the Soviet leadership presented in 1957. There are still questions about certain witness testimonies. What we have learned now is that Wallenberg almost certainly was alive 6 days after his official death date. So the fact is that the Russian side has lied about this, has withheld crucial details about this for decades. So the question is why? Does that mean that he lived longer? Does that mean, and could he have lived longer? Yes, he could have. He could have stayed under investigation. He could have been transferred to another prison, although this would have almost certainly required him to be charged and sentenced. So in my view, it seems that he was possibly alive definitely after 1947. I mean, after this official death date. How long, we just simply do not know. But we know now that almost certainly the Russian side knows more and has more documentation about what happened, and that's the key. We need to get to that.
Why is the Wallenberg story so important 80 years later? What's so important about his story? Why are we talking about this today, and why is it important to do so?
Well, one reason is what I mentioned before about the insistence on the right to the truth, the insistence on historical truth. Remembrance is important, but historic truth is essential in order to, both are important to learn from history, to have some kind of sense of of the of facts and what happened, and so that we do not repeat the same mistakes. Although we are, obviously not very good at learning from history, but information, truth is essential. Truthful, meaningful information is essential. And the other thing is that Wallenberg's legacy as a political prisoner, I mean, there's a direct line between, what Wallenberg did, standing up for human rights, and also paying a very high price for this activism. There's a direct line between prisoners like him and, activists who are in prison in Russia today, and the hundreds and thousands of people who are being jailed for standing up for rights and freedom of expression and basic human dignity. So, in my view, what the case represents is that the past is present. This is the most important lesson. This is not just an old historical issue. The issues at the heart of the Wallenberg case are as relevant today as they were 80 years ago.
Well, we sadly don't have a lot of time left because we have to move on to our next guest. But I just wanted to say, Susanne, that your work has been absolutely incredible. I've followed it for quite a while. I can't imagine the kind of resilience that you have and the frustrations that you've come across, and yet the great compassion that you've shown toward this one man who represents everything that's wonderful about men and women who did not stand by during that darkest chapter of the 20th century. So I wish you all the best. I hope it isn't snowing too hard up there. Please come to DC. We'll give you a tour of the memorial. And I just wanted to say thanks on behalf of Friends for your time and a fantastic presentation. Very, very illuminating indeed. Thanks for joining us, Susanne.
Thank you, Alex, and it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.